We shall now begin the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia, pursuant to the Council Resolution 36/32. It's my pleasure to welcome the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia, Ms. Rona Smith. You are welcome. Before I give the floor to the Special Rapporteur, I would like to remind you that the list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to Ms. Smith for her presentation. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honour of presenting my third substantive report on the human rights situation in Cambodia, UN Document A, HRC 3973. As your Excellencies are aware, 2017 to 2018 was an election period in Cambodia, with local commune elections on the 4th of June 2017, Senate elections on the 25th of February 2018, and National Assembly elections on the 29th of July this year. Consequently, a significant focus of my work over the year has been monitoring the impact of the elections on the human rights situation. Given the questions and comments of so many of your Excellencies during my interactive dialogue with the Council last year, I have submitted an addendum to my annual report which seeks to analyse the human rights situation as it pertains to the elections. The Royal Government of Cambodia has submitted a full response to this addendum, which I have reproduced in full as a second addendum to my report. I would like to take this opportunity to appraise the Council of my main concerns and conclusions. First, however, I would like to formally thank the Royal Government of Cambodia for their cooperation over the last year, even if we did not necessarily agree on all the issues we discussed. I would also like to thank the Government for the invitations to visit in August 2017 and again in March-April 2018, as well as for facilitating so many meetings with government ministers during both visits. I note too the government responses to individual formal communications from myself and other mandate holders, and I strongly encourage and welcome this ongoing dialogue. I would also like to acknowledge the excellent support from OHCHR in Geneva and Phnom Penh over the last year, which has greatly supported me in discharging my mandate from the Council. Mr. Vice President, Cambodia had made impressive strides towards embedding the principles of a multi-party liberal democracy in its laws, policies and practice until last year. As I noted in my last oral update, the June 2017 commune elections were generally considered free and fair, in spite of some concerns over threats and intimidation of political actors and civil society. This result, seen in light of the gradual progress of elections from 1993 onwards, the modern period in Cambodia, tended to suggest that, as in any democracy, an opposition in Cambodia could gain government through peaceful elections, as envisaged in the Paris Peace Accords and the National Constitution. However, the political situation deteriorated rapidly. As I reported to this Council orally a year ago, the President of the main opposition party at that time, the Cambodia National Rescue Party, or CNRP, Mr. Kem Sokha, had been arrested on treason-related charges in September 2017. Subsequently, in October, the Ministry of Interior filed a motion with the Supreme Court, pursuant to provisions enacted in March 2017, to dissolve the CNRP. On 16 November it was dissolved, and thereafter, in accordance with laws fast-tracked whilst the court was seized of the matter, all CNRP seats were redistributed to other political parties who, at that time, held no seats in the National Assembly, and commune positions were also reallocated. This dramatically affected the previous results of the 2013 national elections and the 2017 commune elections by disenfranchising the more than 40% of the electorate that had voted for CNRP representatives. The ruling Cambodian People's Party, the CPP, secured most of the commune-level seats in the redistribution, resulting in the CPP holding 99% of the commune chief positions. The redistribution at the commune level directly affected the indirectly elected Senate in February 2018. The ruling CPP took all the elected seats in the Senate. The national elections in July 2018 proceeded without the hitherto main opposition party and without principal opposition political actors. 118 were banned by the Supreme Court from all political activities. In August 2018, the National Election Committee confirmed that the CPP had won all the seats in the National Assembly. The country is therefore de facto a single-party state. The multi-party liberal democracy envisaged by the Constitution consigned to history for at least the next 5 years, which is the duration of the current Parliament. A little over a year ago, many had hope and expectations that multi-party democracy had taken root in Cambodia. I have concluded in my addendum report that the 2018 national elections represent a departure from this trend. This clearly calls into question the genuineness of these elections, as stipulated in Article 25 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which Cambodia has accepted. Mr. Vice President, I also raise in the addendum concerns about respect for human rights in the lead-up to the national elections. Laws have been used to restrict debate and target media, political opponents, civil society organisations and individuals. In March 2018, lèse-majesté provisions were introduced in Cambodian law, and at least 3 persons have reportedly been arrested. Such provisions are not compatible with Cambodia's obligations to respect freedom of speech. In May 2018, the Ministers of Interior, Information and Posts and Telecommunications adopted an inter-ministerial proclamation to control social media based on restrictions which are vague and ill-defined, not having sufficient clarity to justify limitations on freedom of expression. In response to calls for a boycott of the elections, the government and officials of the National Election Committee referred to the boycott appeals as violating national law. In May, the NEC, National Election Committee, Chair, wrote to the Ministry of Interior asking for legal action on grounds that the boycott appeal was affecting public order and national security, causing confusion and loss of trust in the election. Yet, calls for a boycott of elections in a non-compulsory vote, as is the case in Cambodia, are permitted under international human rights law. Unfettered and robust public debate, particularly in an election, is crucial. Such debate depends on the free communication of ideas concerning public and political issues, as well as on public figures, particularly those highly placed in the political and constitutional system. This is so even if those ideas and comments might be opposing the government or otherwise controversial. The use of information and communication technologies is an extremely important means to achieve this, not least in Cambodia. The government has much to do. I welcome the release of a number of people from detention, mostly political actors, following the confirmation of the results of the National Assembly elections. While this is encouraging, with several individuals now able to enjoy their basic personal and family rights, the charges against many of them remain, so they have not been found innocent. Rather, they remain under threat of being detained again at any time whilst awaiting their trial. Kem Sokha, the leader of the former opposition Cambodia National Rescue Party, who had his detention extended by the court in August, was subsequently released under judicial supervision in September with conditions essentially amounting to house arrest. The charges against him remain. I recall the views of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, issued in April 2018, that the ongoing detention of Kem Sokha was arbitrary. I would draw to Your Excellency's attention once again the situation of the 5 staff and former staff of Ad Hoc, a prominent NGO in Cambodia. While they were released in June 2017, after 427 days in pre-trial detention, they remained under judicial supervision until their verdict was announced today in Phnom Penh. This was almost 2.5 years from their arrest, clearly an infringement of the right to trial within a reasonable time. Today, the court convicted them on counts of bribery of a witness or complicity thereof. As I said in May 2016, this entire episode raised serious questions about the role and integrity of the whole judicial process and appeared to be nothing more than a politically motivated persecution of civil society. Other individuals have been accorded royal pardons. For example, Tep Vanny, a land rights activist whose history is well known to many council members, and only at the weekend, James Ricketson, the Australian filmmaker convicted on the 31st of August 2018 of treason, espionage and collecting information prejudicial to national defence. He was pardoned, freed and deported. In late August, 14 members of the former CNRP, previously convicted on insurrection charges, were also pardoned, despite losing their appeals earlier in the year. Yet these pardons, while welcome, do not deal with the concerns previously expressed about the fairness of the original trials. It is also concerning that royal pardons should be granted, in the case of James Ricketson, such a short time after a court conviction. Mr Vice President, I call on the government to make concerted efforts to improve the human rights situation. In this regard, the government should move to expand civil society space and create a more favourable and open environment for civil society to operate. Cambodia used to be well renowned for this. I encourage the government to withdraw the requirement from October 2017 for civil society actors to give prior notification to the Ministry of Interior before undertaking activities. Similarly, I encourage the government to review administrative requirements placed in civil society organisations such as tax laws to ensure they are clearly explained, progressively introduced, not burdensome to comply with, and are transparently implemented by relevant authorities. These two actions alone could do much to expand civil society space and rebuild lost trust and confidence. They would be much more than symbolic gestures as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders in December of this year. As I conclude, Mr Vice President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I note that Cambodia has periodic reports scheduled for several treaty bodies over the next year and is preparing for its third cycle of Universal Periodic Review early in 2019. All states, therefore, have the opportunity to offer their considered views on the human rights situation in Cambodia. Cambodia will also have its voluntary national review by the high-level Political Forum on Sustainable Development in 2019, during which I note the forum will highlight SDG 16 on peace, justice and strong institutions. The Royal Government of Cambodia has extended an invitation for my next mission in October-November this year. During that mission, I intend to continue my dialogue with the government from last year and examine issues around realising human rights in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. I am hopeful that this mission will enrich the Cambodian Sustainable Development Goals in time for their upcoming adoption by the Royal Government. These milestones related to human rights mechanisms in the Sustainable Development Goals are all significant. I encourage the government to use the lead-up and follow-up to these milestones to take concrete steps to improve the human rights situation and ensure that no one is left behind. As we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, every step counts in the promotion and protection of everyone's human rights to achieve sustainable development and lasting peace for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Please note that the list of speakers is now closed. As is the practice in our discussions, we will start by hearing the delegation of the concerned country. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia. You have a total of 5 minutes. I understand that you will take 3 minutes now and 2 at the end of the interactive dialogue. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, to start, my delegation wishes to thank Professor Smith for the annual report on which our comments in detail can be found on the extranet. As a country with outstanding record of ratification of almost all core international human rights instruments, Cambodia is committed to work with all UN human rights mechanisms. We are the first country to accommodate OHCHR first field office. Even though the office has existed in Cambodia since 1993, the government still determines to continue working with it for years to come, in expecting that the office will adhere to the provision of the MOU and its mandate. We are committed to cooperate with other processes, including the UPR. That is why we had accepted 79.5% at the second cycle, and we will participate in the third cycle next year. We have been in dialogue with 6 country mandate holders consecutively since 1993. All requests for visits and proposed meetings have been granted, including that of Professor Smith's upcoming visit. Unfortunately, though, the report highlights very few positive developments, disregarded the reality on the ground. Non-credible and politically motivated sources of information have been reflected in the report. The principle of impartiality in information gathering have not been fairly applied. Some allegations as well are too vague, which open to subjective interpretation and political manipulation at the expense of the government reputation. However, these unfair treatments do not deter Cambodians' commitment. We are committed to the principle of multi-party democracy system, in which a government shall be elected through a periodic free and fair election. That is why the government held the July 29 election as scheduled. The mere absence of one former political party should not be interpreted that human rights or freedom of expression in Cambodia has been undermined or curtailed. Boycotting election is not a crime under Cambodian law, but it is where one undermines other rights or destroys public trust on election. In this regard, the Special Rapporteur should read in good faith Article 142 of the Law on Election of Members of the National Assembly. In fact, the high turnout of 83.2%, smooth electoral process with the absence of violence unequivocally signifies that how human rights and democracy have deeply rooted and broadly flourished in Cambodian society, for which the Special Rapporteur should have applauded. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. As is part of our interactive dialogue, I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the Special Rapporteur and to make comments. Before I give the floor to the first speaker on the list, I would like to remind you that the speaking time limit for the interactive dialogue is 2 minutes for all. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. We thank Special Rapporteur Rhoda Smith for her work and for the report on the human rights situation in Cambodia. As the report outlines, there has been a sharp decline of political and civil space in Cambodia over the past year. We join others in expressing deep concern over the restrictive conditions in which the Cambodian parliamentary elections took place in July. We would like to emphasize that an election from which the main opposition party is effectively excluded can't be considered legitimate. The arrests, threats and harassment directed against media and civil society underscores the severity of the situation. Others have fled the country in fear of arbitrary arrest. We call on the Cambodian government to drop all criminal charges against opposition leader Kem Sokha and remove all restrictions against him. All other individuals imprisoned for exercising their fundamental rights must also be unconditionally released and have all charges against them dropped. Prior to this year's election, we noted a steady progress of elections in terms of compliance with international human rights standards. We now call on the government of Cambodia to reopen democratic space. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. The European Union thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report. We welcome the government's ongoing cooperation with the Special Rapporteur, the OHCHR and other UN mechanisms with a view to further strengthening the capacity of governmental and non-governmental institutions to promote and protect human rights in the country. The last year has seen significant steps backwards for Cambodia's fragile democracy. At the general election in July, following the enforced dissolution of the main opposition party, the ruling party won all seats in the National Assembly. The election took place in a highly restrictive environment and was clearly not representative of the democratic will of the Cambodian citizens. In February, we stressed that the electoral process could not be considered legitimate after the exclusion of the main opposition party. We suspended financial assistance to the National Election Committee and declined to observe the July elections. We stated that we may consider specific targeted measures if the situation did not improve. Respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including labour rights, is essential for maintaining EU trade preferences. We sent in July a fact-finding mission to Cambodia to evaluate the situation on the ground. Decisions on any possible further steps will be based on the information gathered during this mission. We would like to reiterate that an electoral process from which the main opposition party has been arbitrarily excluded is not legitimate. We call for the swift reversal of the dissolution of the CNRP. We acknowledge the recent transfer of opposition leader Kem Sokha to his family home, even though under very restrictive conditions. We now expect dropping all charges and removing all restrictions placed upon him. We also expect the government to allow civil society organizations to fulfill their legitimate role. Madam Special Rapporteur, what more can this Council do to support respect for human rights in Cambodia? What measures would you recommend states to take to encourage the authorities to return to the path of democracy? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Merci.
Thank you, President. Our thanks for the report. As a long-standing friend of the Cambodian people, Canada remains concerned at the outcome of the electoral campaign of last July. The electoral campaign was stained with intimidation and manipulation of polls. The imprisonment of the opposition leader and the undermining of the CNRP are clear signs of the deteriorating situation. Using the judiciary to harass, intimidate and eliminate the opposition and to suppress civil society and freedom of press is not a sign of free and fair elections. Canada supports the Cambodian people in their right to freely elect their leaders. We call upon the government to protect the civil rights of its people as well as their freedom of expression and political participation. We welcome the spirit of cooperation expressed by the Cambodian representative in his statement a few moments ago. Canada is encouraged by the release and judicial supervision of Kem Sokha, but we will continue to bring pressure to bear on the government to withdraw the baseless and arbitrary charges levelled against the opposition leader. I would conclude with a question. How can the international community defend and promote with conviction democracy and human rights in Cambodia while ensuring ongoing dialogue and commitment from the political party in power? Thank you.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
I thank you, Mr. Vice President. Germany aligns itself with the statement of the EU. We highly appreciate the work of the Special Rapporteur on Cambodia. We thank her for her report, and we also welcome the government of Cambodia's cooperation with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. We are deeply worried about the deteriorating human rights situation in Cambodia and the increasing authoritarian tendencies, as demonstrated in July's illegitimate elections, from which the main opposition party was excluded and which resulted in one-party rule. Voters considering abstaining faced systematic intimidations. Civil society and independent media suffered widespread harassments. We note that the opposition leader Kem Sokha was released from prison on bail under strict conditions and is placed under house arrest. We call upon the government to immediately drop the charges and personal restrictions against him. We also call upon the government of Cambodia to stop misusing the legal system to suppress critical voices and to instead allow for open debate and critical reporting. Furthermore, the government should address the urgent questions of economic development, labour rights, and in particular land rights. We stand by Cambodia's representatives of civil society, opposition parties and independent media who continue to challenge the government's political course despite the widespread climate of repression. Madam Special Rapporteur, how can the international community step up its efforts to help human rights defenders under threat in Cambodia? I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Mr. Vice President, Switzerland thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report and reiterates its support for her mandate. Switzerland welcomes the cooperation of Cambodia with the Rapporteur during her March visit. Switzerland encourages the government to step up this cooperation so that the Rapporteur can hold confidential talks with detainees. Madam Special Rapporteur, Switzerland takes note of your assessment of the 2018 elections and is deeply concerned by the deteriorating respect for civil and political rights, notably marked by the forced dissolution of the main opposition party. We support your call for Cambodia to put in place its international commitments in terms of human rights in order to ensure that its citizens have the right to freedom of expression, opinion, assembly and association without discrimination, as well as the right to fully participate in an inclusive political debate. While Switzerland recognises the economic progress that has been made and which has paved the way to the improvement of certain economic and social rights, such as in social protection, nonetheless we share your concern on the recent developments and the growing number of laws which restrict the civic space of human rights defenders and NGOs. Madam Special Rapporteur, What is the most urgent measure that the government of Cambodia must take to relaunch democratic progress which has been made in the past? What specific measures could a country like Switzerland envisage taking, as neutral and geographically distant as we are from Cambodia, to strengthen human rights there? How can we ensure that new laws and manuals on the political and electoral process include the opinions of civil society and are in line with the relevant international norms? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, sir. I only took up my post this morning, so this is the first statement I've made before the Council, so I'd like to wish this session every success. Mr. Vice President, France aligns itself with the statement of the European Union, of course, but first of all we'd like to welcome the remarkable work of the Special Rapporteur and thank her for her report to this Council. France is concerned at the conclusions finding that the general human rights situation has worsened since last year, in particular in the context of the July 2018 legislative elections. These were held in a climate which has not enabled the opposition, the media or civil society to work unhindered. Implementing human rights is a vital condition for sustainable peace, stability and development, of course. We share the recommendations of the Special Rapporteur on the need to remove all restrictions to fundamental freedoms affecting human rights defenders, civil society, the media and NGOs. We take note of the release under judicial supervision of Mr. Kem Sokha, as well as the release of various other opposition members and activists. We call for proceedings against them to be dropped and for the removal of the prohibition of 118 members from the party to carry out political activities for 5 years. The ratification by Cambodia of the optional protocols to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights should be interpreted as a barometer of its preparedness to relaunch democratic dialogue. Madam Special Rapporteur, you recommend that Cambodia should equip itself with mechanisms to monitor and follow up on the SDGs to improve the human rights situation. France would like to know what priority measures you believe should happen in order to support Cambodia in that direction. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan highly appreciates the active approach Special Rapporteur has taken since assuming her mandate in May 2015. This is illustrated by the fact that the Special Rapporteur has visited Cambodia 5 times, including her visit of last March, and has not only met with representatives of the Cambodian government, but also traveling to the provinces to meet with people from various social backgrounds. Japan welcomes the Cambodian government's endeavors to date for reconstruction and development. There still remain, however, a number of challenges to address in order to sustain democratic development. Japan emphasized that the national election in July should be conducted in a manner that duly reflected the will of Cambodia's citizens and urged Cambodia to do so while providing necessary assistance from our side. Nonetheless, the election was disappointing from various perspectives, including that of the large number of invalid votes that were cast. Japan continues to call upon Cambodia to promote the democratic process through dialogue among political stakeholders and protection of the freedom and rights of the Cambodian people. Japan expects the Special Rapporteur to support Cambodia's efforts for the improvement of its human rights situation in cooperation with the Cambodia Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Madam Special, Japan would like to hear the Special Rapporteur's views on Cambodia's technical cooperation needs in order to improve the human rights situation, and also what role that Cambodia OHCHR office could play in providing such cooperation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. Vice President, in Cambodia, new national elections proceeded smoothly. China offers its congratulations and will continue to support the Cambodian people to freely choose a path of development that is suitable for its national conditions, and will do its utmost to support economic and social development in the country. In recent years, with the efforts of the leadership of the royal government of Cambodia and the Cambodian people, the country maintains political stability and economic development, improves people's living standard constantly, and scores progress in its human rights. The achievement in Cambodia is recognized by all, and it is most valuable. China appeals to the international community to follow the wishes of the government and people of Cambodia, provide constructive assistance, and do more for the stability and development of the country and for the peace and prosperity of the region. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Myanmar.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation thanks the representative of Cambodia for the updated information on the situation of human rights in this country. We also take note of the report of the Special Reporter. We welcome Cambodia's continued constructive engagement with the relevant UN human rights mechanism, including that of the Special Procedure of the Human Rights Council. My delegation commends Cambodia for its effort to improve human rights situation over the past years. We encourage the international community to provide technical assistance and capacity building for national development and improvement of overall human rights situation in Cambodia. We believe that only through engagement and constructive dialogue, human rights mechanism will effectively contribute to the people. Politicization of human rights carry exclusively negative consequences. As a member of ASEAN, Myanmar supports Cambodia in its endeavor for economic and social achievement. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia too thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report. We welcome Cambodia's ongoing dialogue with the Special Rapporteur and its history of UN cooperation. However, we share the Special Rapporteur's concerns about the human rights situation in Cambodia, which has deteriorated over the past year. We are concerned that not all political parties, civil society and media can operate freely. We welcome ongoing efforts by Cambodia to promote gender equality and improve the rights of women. Australia partners with Cambodia on practical initiatives to address these challenges. Australia was disappointed the Cambodian people were not able to choose their representatives freely in the national election on the 29th of July. The national election process, including exclusion of the main opposition party, undermined...
Thank you. I now invite Ms. Smith to respond to the questions and comments made at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Your Excellencies, thank you very much indeed for the comments, questions and for the recommendations that you have made to me in my mandate and also with relevance to the Cambodian delegation. If I may take this opportunity to respond to a few of the points that are raised at this juncture. I heard many questions about what members of the Council can do to further engage Cambodia in the progressive development and promotion of international human rights, which they have accepted. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, there are many opportunities for Council members to do so, not least with the imminent Universal Periodic Review process, which allows states to engage directly with Cambodia. And I would also encourage states who have mind of some form of technical cooperation to enter into discussions with the Cambodian delegation to pursue what ways they can support Cambodia in developing and strengthening human rights in general and with particular reference to the Sustainable Development Goals. With respect to the Sustainable Development Goals and prioritisation, in my view, maybe it's because I'm an academic, Sustainable Development Goals, like human rights, are all relevant, they're all universal, they're all interdependent and interrelated. I think, based on my report, one of the key ones is obviously SD 16, with peace, justice and strong institutions. But I would also reiterate the fact that in Cambodia, as anywhere, human rights cannot be selectively ignored or respected, and they must never be sacrificed. And as I mentioned in my report, human rights are necessary to ensure that we have peace in Cambodia, and peace without justice is unsustainable, and development without freedom risks leaving people behind. Thank you.
I thank you. We shall now return to our list of speakers, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, sir. Venezuela is participating in this interactive dialogue in the firm belief that it is only through genuine dialogue and cooperation, founding pillars of the work of this Council, that it is possible to move forward in protecting human rights. We reiterate that the issue of human rights cannot be addressed through selective imposition of specific mandates against sovereign states, all the more so when these do not enjoy the consent of the concerned country. Cambodia has given credible signs of cooperation with this Council and UN mechanisms. It has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child and CEDAW and has submitted all its periodic reports. It has proven that it is prepared to fight for equality and against gender-based violence head-on. The government guarantees full exercise of freedom of expression in the country through over 550 printed media, 148 news websites and a vast network of over 20 open signal television channels and 112 cable channels. We commend the holding of national elections in July with historic turnout of 83%, a clear demonstration of the entirely democratic tenor of its multi-party system and the trust of its citizens being placed in the electoral institutions of the country as they turned out at the polls to freely express their political preferences. We take note of the report of the Special Rapporteur. We urge for respect for the Constitution and laws in Cambodia, promoting civilized and democratic practices without bias by the political opposition. While the mandate exists, it should be in line with the Code of Conduct of Special Procedures and should respect the principles of respect for sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs enshrined in the UN Charter. The Special Rapporteur must openly condemn those calling for racial hatred, of defamation, and the Chair interrupts.
Representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Belgium fully associates itself with the Declaration of the European Union. Mrs. Smith, my delegation would like to thank you for your report and presentation on the human rights situation in Cambodia. Belgium welcomes some positive developments realized by the government of Cambodia in the area of economic and social rights, such as investments in healthcare and social security. We remain, however, very concerned about the deterioration in the area of political rights and fundamental freedoms, especially in the framework of the 2018 elections. For a democratic process to be credible and fair, an environment is required in which political parties, media and civil society can enjoy their political rights in freedom, without fear of being imprisoned, threatened or banned from carrying out their roles. Belgium therefore deplores the dissolution of the main opposition party and the reallocation of seats to unelected representatives, the imprisonment of political opponents and restrictions on the freedom of expression, as these are all signs of a shrinking democratic space. Mrs. Smith, we welcome the recent release of some political prisoners, but what additional structural measures would you recommend the government of Cambodia to take to strengthen the democratic space and empower civil society actors? Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Kingdom thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report. The UK is deeply concerned at the current human rights situation in Cambodia. We share the Special Rapporteur's concerns about the severe regression of political rights, marked by the dissolution of the CNRP and the banning of 118 CNRP officials from political activity. We urge the government of Cambodia to allow for credible, multi-party democracy and free debate. This was conveyed to the Cambodian Prime Minister in August by the Right Honourable Mark Field MP, UK Minister of State, as the first visiting overseas minister after the national elections. We urge the government of Cambodia to ensure that opposition and civil society voices are heard and given a credible role in policy making. The transfer of Kem Sokha to his family home was a move in the right direction, but we encourage the government to drop all charges against Kem Sokha and to take necessary and significant further steps to ensure the widening of political participation in Cambodia. We echo the Special Rapporteur's recommendation that the government should remove the ban on the 118 former CNRP members from engaging in political activities. We urge the government to explore ways in which the international community can support the implementation of the Special Rapporteur's recommendations. Mr. Vice President, acknowledging the steps taken by the government since the Special Rapporteur's report issued, we would welcome her views on what further steps she believes are required to ensure greater and fairer political participation in Cambodia. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union. Ireland thanks the Special Rapporteur for her work in reporting on the situation of human rights in Cambodia and asks the Government of Cambodia to note her assessment. Ireland welcomes the positive gains made in Cambodia in respect of economic and social rights. Ireland is, however, concerned at the findings of the Special Rapporteur on the restriction of political space and that the highly restrictive environment in which the recent election in Cambodia took place was not representative of the democratic will of Cambodian citizens. We are also concerned by the continued restrictions on civil society space, the media and human rights defenders. We respectfully ask the Cambodian authorities to create conditions conducive to free political debate and competition, with a view to rebuilding a democracy in which the media and civil society, including human rights defenders, can freely exercise their rights. In particular, Ireland supports the Special Rapporteur's recommendation that the ban on the 118 former CNRP members from engaging in political activities be removed. The recent release on bail of Mr. Kem Sokha on humanitarian grounds and the release and pardoning of others is a positive and welcome development. However, Ireland calls for the full and unconditional release of Mr. Sokha and for measures which will allow free political engagement and the protection and freedom of human rights defenders in keeping with the Cambodian Constitution and the international treaties which Cambodia has ratified. Finally, Ireland would like to ask the Special Rapporteur what steps states can take to better support civil society engagement in Cambodia. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. New Zealand welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia, including the addendum from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the recommendations contained therein. We urge the Government of Cambodia to fully implement all of the recommendations in the report. New Zealand has long held concerns about the serious deterioration of the civil and political environment in Cambodia in contravention of Cambodia's constitution and its international obligations and commitments. We regret that Cambodia's July 29 parliamentary elections were neither free nor fair and failed to represent the will of the Cambodian people. An electoral process from which the main democratic opposition party has been arbitrarily excluded cannot be considered genuine or legitimate. The abolition of the CNRP and subsequent capture of all 125 National Assembly seats by the ruling party contravenes the spirit and intent of a constitution that provides for multi-party democracy. In the Human Rights Council, we have previously called for the ending of arbitrary detention of all political prisoners. We therefore acknowledge the provisional release of 14 government critics early this month as a positive but limited step forward. But as the Special Rapporteur has noted, charges remain for many of these individuals. We also welcome the release of Kem Sokha on bail on grounds of ill health, but call on the Government of Cambodia to immediately end his house arrest and drop remaining charges against him. We are also concerned at reports today of the conviction of 4 human rights defenders and a National Election Committee official. We reiterate our call on the Government of Cambodia to ensure the right of equal participation in political and public affairs, to cease all harassment, threats and intimidation of political opposition, journalists and civil society, and to ensure full compliance with international human rights norms and standards by amending the Cambodian Criminal Code, the law on political parties, law on associations and non-governmental organisations as recommended by the Special Rapporteur, OHCHR and the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Philippines takes note of the report prepared by the Special Rapporteur. We in the international community need to take full cognizance of where Cambodia came from and how much it has achieved since the Paris Peace Agreement was concluded in 1991. Cambodia is currently enjoying the longest peace in its modern history and as a result is well on its way towards achieving greater progress, development and prosperity. Cambodia has one of the highest rates of growth in its Human Development Index in the Asia Pacific. Globally, Cambodia has the 8th fastest rate of HDI growth. Moreover, the 2017 inequality-adjusted HDI shows the loss in human development due to inequality at 19.4%, considerably better than the global average for developing countries and medium human development countries. These significant achievements clearly show that the Cambodian government is doing something right for its own people, and this needs to be acknowledged by the international community. The international community can better engage Cambodia by helping it strengthen its systems and institutions in order to allow the democratic space to thrive and prosper and support the comprehensive development of the Cambodian people. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The LAPIAS takes note of the Special Rapporteur reports on Cambodia, and we also would like to thank the delegation of Cambodia for its comprehensive update on the human rights in the country. We congratulate the National Election Committee for its implementation of the electoral system to ensure that the 2018 general election in July was free and fair manner, which has created a stable functioning democratic process in Cambodia. As had been proven that Cambodia's economic growth rate of 7% that resulted in rapid development, which has provided resources to improve social protection and access to education, decent work and health care. Mr. Vice President, we share our concern of the international community and the political situation in Cambodia. As a neighboring country and ASEAN member, the LAPIA has been closely following the situation in Cambodia. My delegation commends the Cambodia constructive engagement and cooperation with the UN Human Rights Mechanism, including the UPR process, treaty bodies in cooperation with the international community and party concerned. In conclusion, we would like to call on the international community to constructively engage and continue to provide technical assistance and capacity building to Cambodia in order to fulfill its international human rights obligation. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thailand takes note of the report of the Special Rapporteur. We commend Cambodia for its cooperation extended to the Special Rapporteur during her missions. Like all countries, Cambodia faces human rights challenges. We encourage the government of Cambodia to do its utmost to address these challenges, to harness the synergy and mutually reinforcing linkages between human rights and the 2030 Agenda. International cooperation, particularly through effective technical cooperation and capacity building, is an important means through which states can enhance their capacity to promote and protect human rights in accordance with their international obligations. We should also underline the importance of engagement, constructive dialogue and concrete actions that will bring about real changes on the ground and ensure that no one is left behind. To this end, we encourage the government of Cambodia to continue to cooperate with international partners and relevant stakeholders in order to strengthen efforts that promote and protect human rights, especially among vulnerable groups such as children, women and persons with disability. In closing, we encourage the government of Cambodia, the Special Rapporteur and the OHCHR to further the ongoing cooperation. Thailand stands ready to support Cambodia's efforts. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Vietnam takes note of the presentation of the Special Rapporteur on the situation in Cambodia. We congratulate Cambodia's achievements in social-economic development over the past years, which contribute greatly to realizing the SDGs, enhancing the living standards and the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms of Cambodian people. We understand many of Cambodia's challenges in its path of development and believe that given the current efforts of Cambodian government, many of these issues would be resolved. We encourage Cambodia to continue its commitment in promoting and protecting the rights of vulnerable and ethnic minority groups, to create favorable conditions and take appropriate measures to ensure legitimate rights and interests of Cambodians of Vietnamese origin in accordance with Cambodian law and international law. Regarding the comment by the Special Rapporteur on the situation of the Vietnamese Central Highlands ethnic minority people in Cambodia, we would like to emphasize that Vietnam fully observed the tripartite Memorandum of Understanding on the settlement of issues relating to the Vietnamese Central Highlands ethnic minority people in Cambodia, concluded by Vietnam, UNHCR, and Cambodia in 2005, and reiterates that this agreement should be implemented in good faith as an effective solution to the situation. Mr. Vice President, as a neighboring country and a fellow ASEAN member, Vietnam will continue our close and constructive cooperation and support with Cambodia in its overall development process. I thank you.
I thank you. I now invite again Ms. Smith to respond to questions and comments made at this stage. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you, Excellencies. With response to the questions on Cambodia returning to a position of greater democracy, then I would say that many of your Excellencies have already raised several important steps towards that. So lifting the charges against His Excellency Kem Sokha, lifting the ban on 118 political actors, allowing for the reinstatement of CNRP and other political parties, and obviously expanding the space for civil society and dialogue between all civil society and the government. The UN is one mechanism that can be used for these interactions. And then also ensuring that we remove the restrictions on civil society, such as the October notification requirements, and make sure that all of the laws and regulations are applied fairly and transparently to civil society. For governments looking at further technical assistance in Cambodia, the governments can include human rights in their dialogues and interactions with the Cambodian government and in visits to Cambodia or by Cambodian delegations to other countries. I would also say that the government itself in Cambodia should and could systematically review all existing laws for full compatibility with international human rights standards, as New Zealand commented. And finally, with respect to the comments with Venezuela, I can assure you that I, and I think every other special procedure, always strongly condemns any form of racial discrimination or racial rhetoric by any political actor or indeed any individual. Thank you.
Thank you. We shall now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. I give the floor to Non-Violent Radical Party.
Sham election in Cambodia. Mr. Vice President, 29 July 2018 marked the death of democracy in Cambodia, a new dark day of its history. It was to be a celebration of democracy where people would have exercised their right to choose their own government. Unfortunately, the choice had already been made from them before polls opened. The ruling party moved ahead with a sham election in full breach of the Cambodian constitution and the international commitments, obligations of the country. Subsequently, what was left of the democracy in name only has been replaced with an outright dictatorship. The ban of the opposition and imprisonment of its leader, the shutdown of independent media and civil society, and switch-on activists has made this election unacceptable before it even began. 29 July will remember as the day when the constitutional multi-party democracy was replaced illegally and UN constitutionally by a one-party rule were the basic principle of the Paris Peace Accords 1991, which defined the political system of the country, have been blatantly breached, thus invoking a regional security crisis. In view of the unilateral abrogation of the Cambodian regime from the Paris Peace Accords, we call on the co-president of the Paris Conference, Indonesia and France, to invoke the Article 29 of the Accords that call for immediate convocation of the conference. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. I give the floor to Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development for a joint statement.
Mr. Vice President, we share the Special Rapporteur's concerns on human rights violations in the context of the 2018 National Assembly elections, including on restrictions to freedoms of expression, assembly and association, and threats to human rights defenders, media, and the political opposition. Such increased restrictions prevented this year's elections from being free and fair. While we acknowledge the recent release of human rights defenders and political activists, we note that restrictions are not fully lifted and many still face detention. As the Rapporteur's report indicates, an ever-increasing number of legislation and administrative provisions undermine democracy and civic space. Onerous reporting procedures and vague provisions in Lango impose severe restrictions on civil society, while the trade union law threatens labor rights. Provisions of the Penal Code, in particular the recent amendment to add lèse-majesté provisions, as well as the proclamation on controls of publication of website and social media processing via Internet, add broad restrictions on freedom of expression and undermine protection for human rights defenders, journalists, and dissidents. The draft cybercrime law, if adopted, will extend these restrictions. Genuine reform cannot be achieved without the repeal or review of restrictive legislation in line with international human rights standards. We call on the government of Cambodia to release and withdraw all politically motivated charges against human rights defenders, opposition leaders, journalists, and civil society actors. We condemn today's conviction of the 4 human rights defenders from ad hoc and an official of the NEC on trumped-up criminal charges related to their legitimate human rights work. Furthermore, the government's non-responsiveness to technical cooperation is concerning. We call for Cambodia and the country mandate to be considered in the future under Item 4, unless meaningful steps are taken to expedite the implementation of all recommendations by the Special Rapporteur and previous recommendations of successive Special Rapporteurs in close cooperation with the OHCHR. Thank you.
I thank you. International Commission of Jurists, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, the findings reported by the Special Rapporteur demonstrate the utter inadequacy of the Council's current focus on technical assistance and capacity building in Cambodia. The elections, neither free nor fair, resulted in the ruling party winning all seats in the National Assembly, and post-election the government continues to misuse laws to violate rights and harass journalists, human rights defenders, political opposition members, and ordinary individuals. Unjustified espionage charges hang over 2 journalists who spent 8 months in detention before being released pending trial. A filmmaker sentenced to imprisonment for alleged espionage was only released by royal pardon after more than a year in jail. Days after release from 2 years in jail for conducting a peaceful protest, a land rights activist was handed a 6-month suspended sentence for a politically motivated charge from 2012. Following his release after 18 months in prison for alleged defamation and incitement offenses, a political commentator fled Cambodia when fresh politically motivated charges were mounted against him. Treason charges remain active against Kem Sokha, leader of the now dissolved main opposition party, now under house arrest. A barber and a school principal remain in prison for allegedly sharing information online in breach of the lèse-majesté law, and a woman remains in prison for alleged insult and incitement offenses for throwing a shoe at a ruling party billboard. Today, 4 senior staff from prominent civil society organization and a National Election Committee official were convicted under politically motivated charges. Madam Special Rapporteur, like others, we ask, what other approaches should the Council, other governments and civil society consider now to ensure human rights and the rule of law in Cambodia, given that technical assistance and capacity building alone seem clearly not to be having the necessary effect? Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada.
Thank you, Vice President.
Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report and the addendum that seriously calls into question the genuineness of the July 2018 elections to meet the requirements of Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. Since the election, which renders Cambodia a single-party state, the government has released several human rights defenders, journalists, and opposition politicians from arbitrary detention. However, these releases do not portend any cessation of harassment of defenders and critics. Releases are not unconditional, and illegitimate charges remain pending indefinitely. Cambodia's government continues to use overbroad laws and executive-controlled courts to criminalize or restrict peaceful expression, association, and assembly by political opponents and civil society. Legitimate human rights education and advocacy is curtailed. Much of this harassment appears to be carried out to protect the business interests of government officials and government-connected business people involved in illegitimate land acquisition. We suggest that the Special Rapporteur consider a special report on illegitimate land acquisition and its impacts on more than 830,000 people in Cambodia since 2000, including involuntary displacement and disproportionate impacts on women, ethnic minorities, and indigenous peoples. Civil and political rights in Cambodia have markedly regressed, and defenders and critics live in fear of reprisals. LRWC urges all state parties to the ICCPR to exercise their collective obligations, erga omnes partes, to insist on the Cambodian government's good faith implementation of Cambodia's duties under the treaty. LRWC also asks all states to urge Cambodia to renew its Memorandum of Understanding with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for a period of 5 years after its expiry on the 31st of December 2018. Thank you, Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to World Organization Against Torture. Absent. We give the floor now to Human Rights Now.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Human Rights Now is deeply concerned that the Cambodian government has mostly ignored the Human Rights Council resolution adopted in the 36th session. Despite international calls for a democratic election, the Cambodian general election in July 2018 has failed, with all seats going to the ruling party, with the Cambodian National Rescue Party, the main opposition, being dissolved and its leaders and members being persecuted, and with a sweeping crackdown on civil society and independent media. In November 2017, the Cambodian Supreme Court ordered the CNRP's dissolution and banned 118 of its senior members from political activity for 5 years. To date, this order is still effective. Independent media such as the Cambodia Daily and over a dozen other radio stations were shut down. The government also detained 2 former journalists from Radio Free Asia on espionage charges until their release on bail in August. A government order also mandated Internet and mobile service providers to block 17 news websites 2 days before the July election, further restricting information to voters. Under such conditions, member states' efforts for a legitimate election, such as Japan's electoral reform assistance, have not resulted in genuine political participation. Mr. Vice President, the actions of Cambodia's government violate Cambodia's constitution, international human rights law, the 1991 Paris Peace Accords. People in Cambodia still deeply suffer from repression. We urge the Cambodian government to immediately end repressive policies towards political opposition, activists, and media, and we call for the establishment of an independent inquiry commission into the July elections, fairness and legitimacy to restore rule of law and democracy in Cambodia. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Association of World Citizens.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Entre 2013
Thank you, Mr. President. Between 2013 and 2018, human rights in Cambodia have become much more restrictive compared to the period during the Paris agreements in 2011. The situation of human rights have deteriorated, but the missions that were sent out to improve the situation have failed. Before the 2018 elections, the government of Cambodia dissolved the major opposition party and NGOs. After the 2018 elections, the elections should be declared invalid given the absence of opposition parties and the absence of an electoral reform. The people had expressed their aspirations for a fair and free electoral system with an independent mechanism to oversee the electoral process as a whole, as well as the establishment of a national electoral commission. We ask the Human Rights Council, to set up a joint committee for the overview of the implementation of all recommendations. If Cambodia rejects this process, then the presence of Cambodia itself under its current government within the UN must be reconsidered. Thank you.
Article 19. Absent. We give the floor to International Federation for Human Rights Leagues. Now, Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Human Rights Watch welcomes the detailed addendum to this year's annual report of the Special Rapporteur regarding the election-related crackdown in Cambodia. On July 29th, a sham election that was neither genuine nor free or fair saw the ruling party secure its continued rule after arbitrarily dissolving the main opposition Cambodia National Rescue Party through politically motivated prosecutions of key leaders of the opposition and government critics, by banning more than 100 opposition members, including elected members of parliament, from political activity for 5 years, by adopting a series of repressive laws aimed at clamping down on the rights to freedom of expression, association and assembly, and through illegally utilizing state assets, including the media and armed forces, to create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. Prime Minister Hun Sen, in power for 33 years, and the CPP have undone all democratic gains since the 1991 Paris Peace Agreements, taking all 125 seats in parliament and creating a de facto one-party state. Civil and political rights have hit a new low. While we welcome the release of some political prisoners, we remain concerned that without the repeal of repressive laws, such as the lèse-majesté clause in the Penal Code, the law on associations and non-governmental organizations, the trade union law, and the law on political parties, arbitrary prosecutions in the country's CPP-controlled courts will continue. Human Rights Watch is also deeply concerned about the expiration of the MOU for the Cambodia Field Office on December 31st. The office has been crucial in supporting civil society and addressing rights violations with the government. Its closure would lead to an escalation of abuses. We call on donors in the UN to press the Cambodian government to renew the OHCHR's mandate. Cambodians are facing a human rights crisis with all the hard-fought freedoms gained in the past decade under threat. Yet the Council has failed before and since the election to take appropriate action. We call on the Council and all UN member states to ensure increased monitoring and reporting by the High Commissioner of the country's deteriorating human rights situation. I thank you.
Thank you. Amnesty International, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Amnesty International shares the concerns of the Special Rapporteur over continued blatant attacks on rights to freedom of association, expression and peaceful assembly by the Cambodian government. During the pre-election period, Cambodian authorities threatened, detained and prosecuted activists, journalists, human rights defenders and dissidents over spurious charges for their human rights work, or simply for a difference of opinion. We recognise the fact that 20 such prisoners have been released since Cambodia's national election in July. However, most of those released still have pending criminal charges and sentences that could be resumed at any time. Hun Sen himself has warned his critics to stay quiet. The shutdown of over 30 radio stations in 2017 for carrying independent news broadcasts continues to hinder the public from receiving information from alternative sources. The crackdown on social media platforms has left many individuals prosecuted with trumped-up charges for simply exercising their freedom of expression. Amnesty International also shares the concern of the Special Rapporteur over repressive legal changes made in Cambodia over the last 5 years. These include changes to the political parties law to give courts arbitrary powers to dissolve parties and changes to the trade unions law effectively criminalising workers' strikes. The laws governing NGOs also give the Interior Ministry similar powers over civil society, resulting in self-censorship by many organisations. These legislations constitute an ever-growing threat to what remains of the civic space. Amnesty International calls on the international community to take concrete measures to address the continuing degradation of the human rights situation in Cambodia. The international community should call on the Cambodian government to immediately release all prisoners of conscience, revoke all charges and convictions against persons released without conditions, end the suppression of independent media, and amend or repeal all repressive laws. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. This was the last speaker whom we could accommodate at this meeting. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia for final remarks. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. For decades, Cambodia has suffered so much as the result of civil war of destruction enmeshed by many actors, including foreign countries. No Cambodian born before 1990s had ever experienced the real test of peace. Until 1998, peace had prevailed all over the country thanks to the win-win policy of Prime Minister Samdech Hun Sen. As the late Secretary General Kofi Annan once said, there is no development without security. The same is true for Cambodia. With peace and security comes development. Peace is a prerequisite for development that the government must defend at any price in order to uphold its people's rights, particularly economic and social rights. Having said that does not mean we ignore other rights and freedom. We listen to all concerns raised based on mutual respect, proper languages and dignity. Any dialogue bearing insulting or humiliating character is not acceptable. HRC is not a forum for launching political propaganda for one's political party at the expense of others. Human rights should not be politicized. It should be applied in a fair and impartial manner. One should subject one's own country or group to the same standard applied on others. Freedom of expression shall be performed with special duty and responsibility, taking into account other rights, national security, public order, as stated by Article 19 of the ICCPR. All citizens are equally treated before law, irrespective of their status. And the recent release on bail, with some judicial conviction of Mr. Kem Sokha, was based on humanitarian act. Under the prerogative of the investigating judge, house arrest has no room in Cambodian law. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Smith for her concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, with respect to the comments of civil society organisations, I would reiterate that Cambodia was previously known for its vibrant civil society movement. To return to that, the government must remove restrictions limiting civil society and NGO activities within Cambodia. The wide range of penal laws regularly invoked against civil society members and actors need also to be systematically reviewed for compliance with international human rights standards. And it's particularly the case with the CPP dominating the legislature and obviously the executive in Cambodia. It is therefore more important than ever that Cambodia ensures that all prospective draft laws are methodically examined for compliance with human rights standards before they are adopted, and moreover that all existing laws must be systematically examined regularly for compliance with international human rights standards, and any laws found wanting must be repealed or amended to better ensure that Cambodia complies with its international human rights standards. It is my belief that it is possible for civil society space to be reopened and revitalised within Cambodia, but that requires action on behalf of the government as well as then regular dialogues and interactions with civil society within Cambodia. Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my closing remarks focus on the future. Peace, society and development are all predicated on a society which affords full respect for all international human rights and fundamental freedoms. It is my hope that work on the localisation plan for the Sustainable Development Goals in Cambodia will ensure there is a focus on peace with justice, development with freedom, and security based and grounded in respect for international human rights and fundamental freedoms. I encourage the adoption of the SDGs with relevant indicators and commitments by the government in Cambodia, and obviously I encourage the adoption of the plan in consultation with civil society organisations, and particularly a focus on SDG 16, including freedom of information law, which is pending, and measures for securing transparency in the judiciary. Looking to the year ahead, there are, as I commented, many opportunities for experts and treaty bodies, states in UPR and in bilateral discussions with Cambodia to work towards ensuring Cambodia strengthens the protection and promotion of human rights in the country. As the UN Special Rapporteur, I stand ready, as always, to assist the country through developing human rights and working with the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that all human rights are respected for everyone in Cambodia. Thank you.
I thank you. This brings us to the end of the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia. I wish to thank Ms. Smith for her presence today and all the participants for their contributions. We'll now take a very short break before beginning the clustered interactive dialogue with the independent expert on the situation of human rights in Somalia. I kindly ask that you remain seated. 1 minute break.